It had always been a statement of intent for General Heinz Guderian that a fully balanced and truly effective armoured division must have its own organic, fully tracked, self-propelled artillery, able to maintain the same rate of advance as the panzers and be immediately to hand to give fire support when needed. That Guderian's notion could have been given reality in the period of German rearmament during the 1930s was a pipe dream. While subtle and sophisticated propaganda fed to audiences at home and abroad fostered the image of an immensely powerful Third Reich, the reality was that the rearmament program was very broad but had little depth. Adolf Hitler wanted war, but he had no intention of submitting Germany to a repeat of the debilitating conflict that had led her to defeat in the Great War. Even the rearmament program as it stood was financed at a much lower level than was propagandized by Hitler, and few were aware of the real economic strains it was causing the German economy even before the war began. When war came, Hitler wanted it to be short and sharp. The conflict that broke out on the 1st of September 1939 saw Germany ill-prepared for anything but a very short war. Certainly the Panzer Arm was nowhere near ready to embark on a major conflict. The medium tanks on which the basis of the war-making potential of the new Panzer Arm were based were only just coming off the production line. Output of panzers was low and was to remain so for some years after war began. At this stage there was no way that the German panzer divisions could expect to be equipped with their own tracked artillery when the tanks they were meant to support had yet to be produced in adequate numbers. This unpreparedness was mirrored in the lorry supply. By the onset of Barbarossa, transport detachments were driving vehicles trawled from the inventory of every country that Germany had conquered. But nowhere was the facade of modernity better seen for what it was than in the artillery. While a small number of artillery pieces employed in direct support of the fast-moving panzer divisions were towed by half-track, by far and away the majority of the army's artillery was pulled by horses. 3 million horses went into Russia with the German army. Equine sinew and muscle underpinned the great advances into the Soviet hinterland in the opening phase of Barbarossa. The scene of miles of horse-drawn columns moving eastwards could have been taken from a snap of German forces doing the same when marching deep into Russia in 1918. Although the German economy was to undertake remarkable expansion in the years ahead, provide self-propelled weapons in large numbers, Guderian never got them in the quantity he deemed necessary. The very first Panzerjäger, a class of lightly armoured self-propelled anti-tank guns mounted on a tank chassis, employed the Panzer 1B. First appearing in 1940, it was built around the former Czech 47mm anti-tank gun, which had both a higher muzzle velocity and a heavier weight of shot than the Germans' own Pak-36. 86 rounds of ammunition was carried. Armour protection for the crew of 3 was minimal. The open-topped and opened-back superstructure mounted just 14.5mm on the gun shield. 202 were converted by Daimler-Benz and Skoda, with production ending in February 1941. Most were employed after 1941 in Russia. A small number of Panzerjäger 1s served in North Africa. Battalion 605, comprising 3 companies, was shipped to Libya in early 1941. This unit participated in all the major battles in the Western Desert through to El Alamein. In late 1940, the same gun was ordered to be mounted on captured French Renault R35 chassis as a replacement for the Panzer I. It saw service mainly in the Normandy campaign. Surviving Panzerjäger 1Bs withdrawn from service in 1943 ended their days in training establishments. Significantly, it was another foreign weapon that was mounted on the next Panzerjägers. It was to prove most fortuitous for the German army that they captured many excellent Soviet 76mm anti-tank guns in 1941. The encounter with new Soviet tanks early in the Russian campaign was a shock to the German army. Intelligence had given no intimation of the existence of the KV-1 or KV-2. Only the proficiency of their military technique compensated the Germans for the technical superiority of these new machines. It was, however, T-34 medium tank that caused the greatest alarm, for it represented a quantum leap in tank design. For German infantry forced to combat these formidable machines, the impotence of the standard 37mm Pak 36 anti-tank gun, already demonstrated in the French campaign, now received more telling confirmation in Russia. Even at point-blank range, the armour-piercing shot from the weapon just bounced off the thick armour of these Soviet monsters. Nor did the 50mm Pak 38, introduced in small numbers just prior to Barbarossa, fare much better. Only at close range could this weapon penetrate the armour of these Soviet tanks. The Germans turned to the 76mm M1936 and 1939 field guns captured in such vast numbers since June 1941. Rechambered to accept the ammunition of the Pak 40 75mm anti-tank gun, which was rushed into service before the end of 1941, the rechristened Pak 36-39 saw service with the German army until the end of the war. The prototype Panzerjäger 38T emerged as early as December 1941. So great was the need to field a self-propelled gun that could take on the powerful Soviet types. The Pak 36-39 was a formidable anti-tank weapon. Although production of the vulnerable Panzer 38T battle tank ended in 1942, its chassis was manufactured as a self-propelled mount for anti-tank and artillery weapons until 1945. The availability of the Panzer IID and E variants in late 1941 also led to their being earmarked for conversion to mount the 76mm anti-tank gun. Surprisingly, the first Panzerjäger 38Ts, known as the Marder III, did not receive their baptism of fire in Russia but with the Afrika Korps. But whether operating in the desert or on the steppes of Russia, the new vehicle was clearly a stopgap design, no matter how desperately needed. While the gun was able to penetrate up to 55mm of armour out to 2,000 metres, this Marder was handicapped by its high silhouette. While in Russia crews could attempt to hide their machine and lie in wait for the enemy before firing, in a desert devoid of cover this was more difficult. Protection was very weak, the gun shield offering a maximum of just 15mm of armour, making the crew quite vulnerable to direct enemy fire as well as shrapnel from shells exploding near to the vehicle. Even so, 363 were produced by BMM of Prague. The cumbersome appearance of the conversion of the Panzer IID into Marder II indicates the urgency with which the 201 produced between April and June 1942 were needed at the front. The Panzerjäger 2D was first seen on newsreel when the tank hunting battalion of the rested and rebuilt 1st Waffen-SS Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, paraded through Paris along the Champs-Élysées, with other detachments in the formation in July 1942. All wear the standard overall colour of very dark grey. Taking the salute was Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief of Army Group West. Most of the 150 machines completed by May 1942 went to the Eastern Front for service with the Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions committed to the German offensive in southern Russia. While the 76mm gun gave a good account of itself, the Marder II also suffered from the same problem as the Marder III of a high silhouette. A firepower demonstration of the Panzerjäger 2D was given to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring when he visited the training unit of the tank hunting battalion of the division named after him in April 1943. Just 2 months later, 10,000 troops of the division were to surrender when the Axis bridgehead in Tunisia fell to the Allies. Development of the 75mm Pak 40 had been slow, even though contracts for the new anti-tank gun had been issued in 1939. The appearance of new Soviet armour had ended the complacency. An accelerated programme led to Rheinmetall Borsig producing the first Pak 40s for service by the end of 1941. The Pak 40 was an excellent weapon. Its low profile allowed its gun crew to maximise advantage of the penetrative power of its armour-piercing shot and range. It could cut through 100mm of armour sloped at 30 degrees at a range of 500 metres. While the normal rate of fire was 12 rounds per minute, an experienced crew could raise that total. The undoubted effectiveness of the Pak 40 saw it employed as the standard anti-tank gun and as a light artillery piece with the German army until the end of the war. It was also employed on numerous chassis as a self-propelled anti-tank gun. In June 1942, Farmo, MAN and Daimler-Benz had been instructed to divert 75% of their Panzer II production so that the chassis could be employed as the basis of a new Panzerjäger mounting the 75mm anti-tank gun. The resultant vehicle, designated the Marder II, was manufactured until June 1943, when the decision was taken to turn over production of all Panzer II chassis to building the Vesper self-propelled light howitzer. By then, 651 Marder IIs had been produced, employing new build, and converted early model Panzer IIs returned to Germany. The Marder II had the by now standard Panzerjäger open-topped configuration, with light armour mounted to the front and sides of the gun compartment. While issued to self-propelled Panzerjäger battalions, many Marder IIs were also used by paratroop units, who, after the high losses in the invasion of Crete, Hitler ordered employed as ground troops. Although serving on all fronts to war's end, the bulk were employed in Russia, where they took a heavy toll of Soviet armour. The reach of the Pak-40 enabled the crew to take out most Russian tanks. With the onset of winter, whitewash was applied to aid concealment of the vehicle as it moved across the wide open steppes. Serving alongside Marder IIs of the SS Panzer Corps in February and March 1943 are mid-production Marder IIIs on the Panzer 38T chassis mounting the 75mm Pak-40, which first left the production line at BMM of Prague in October 1942. Replacing the original Soviet gun Marder III, the new model employed a redesigned lower fighting compartment to house the German Pak-40 anti-tank gun, of which 417 were manufactured. The Marder IIIs of the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler are fighting in the suburbs of the city of Kharkov, the scene of a major battle between the troops of the SS Panzer Corps and those of the Soviet Voronezh front in early March 1943. Marder IIIs saw heavy action throughout 1943. That illustrated here, serving with the Panzerjäger Battalion of the 3rd SS Panzer Grenadier Division Totenkopf at the Battle of Kursk in July. Mid-production Marder IIIs were also extensively employed in the Panzerjäger battalions of Army and Luftwaffe field divisions, serving as far afield as Russia through to Italy. Operation Axis, the long-prepared German contingency plan for the occupation of Italy, took place in September 1943. Among the forces streaming across the mountains into northern Italy was this contingent of late-production Marder IIIs. This new model was the consequence of a major reworking of the Panzer 38T chassis, which saw the engine resighted to the centre of the vehicle and the fighting compartment for the Pak-40 moved to the rear. Nearly 1,000 were manufactured by BMM. Self-propelled guns were employed in far greater numbers than tanks by the Germans in the Italian theatre, the mountainous terrain being more suitable to their tactical employment. This is well demonstrated by this film of a late Marder III operating in the vicinity of Monte Cassino in the first half of 1944. Employing the ruins of a bombed-out village, the Marder crawls out of cover on word of approaching targets. Mindful of the ability of pilots to spot tank tracks from the air, these are brushed away by one of the crew. The Marder moves to a firing position on the edge of the village, giving it a superb vantage point over the valley below. With the enemy targeted, the gunner loads the armour-piercing Panzer Grenade 40 ammunition. After a couple of shots, the Marder scuttles back to its hide before its position can be bracketed by artillery or targeted by enemy aircraft. Late model Marder IIIs saw extensive employment in Normandy from the 6th of June onwards. In common with all German military vehicles in the theatre, extensive camouflage was vital if they were to survive the attentions of Allied fighter bombers. The Germans employed large numbers of the chassis of captured French tanks as the basis of self-propelled guns. While a number of FCM and Hotchkiss chassis were employed to mount the Pak-40, the greatest number were manufactured using the Lorraine tracked carrier. A sizable quantity of these reliable machines had fallen into German hands in 1940, and in 1942, with the desperate need to motorise as many anti-tank guns as possible, the decision was taken to convert 170 Lorraine carriers to mount the Pak-40. While a number found their way to Russia and Italy, the bulk were retained for service with the occupation forces in France. Film of the Lorraine Schlepper is rare, and this comes from Normandy in 1944. Few, if any, of these machines were to survive the destruction of the German forces in the campaign. Most extensively converted of all the French types was the Hotchkiss H-39, which was effectively gutted and rebuilt to mount the Pak-40, just 24 being so modified. All served in France. The final chassis to be adopted to mount the Pak-40 was very much a desperate expedient that reflected Germany's dire military predicament in late 1944. In a bid to place as many anti-tank guns as possible on self-propelled mounts, Hitler ordered that the 251D half-track be modified to mount the Pak-40. The complete weapon, less its wheels, was fitted with little modification into the half-track. Serviced by a crew of 4, it carried 22 rounds of 75mm ammunition. However, the weapon overstressed the chassis and the 251-22 was decidedly overweight. One of the first Hetzers to come off the production lines was presented to Hitler on the occasion of his birthday on the 20th of April 1944. This new variation on the Panzer 38T chassis marked a radical shift away from the conventional tank hunter with its highly vulnerable open-topped crew and gun compartment. The Hetzer, although designed for service in tank hunting battalions, was modelled on the purpose-designed and sophisticated tank destroyers with their fully enclosed and armoured bodies. It was for this reason that the Hetzer was classified not as a Panzerjäger but as a Jagdpanzer. Production of the Hetzer began at the Skoda works and at BMM in May 1944 with the phase-out of the Marder III. Primary armament remained the 75mm gun. While the enclosed armoured body offered the crew far better personal protection than the earlier tank hunters, it also led to cramped conditions, making movement within the machine quite difficult. This also inhibited movement of the gun, which had a constricted field of fire in consequence. In spite of these limitations, the Hetzer became one of the most effective and frequently encountered vehicles serving in the German army in the last year of the war. Successful employment of the assault gun in its adoptive role of tank destroyer led to the development of one type to fulfill both roles, built round an armoured body mounted on the chassis of the Panzer IV. The Jagdpanzer IV entered production with WOMAG in January 1944 and mounted a 75mm L-48 cannon. These served with the 116th Panzer Division in Normandy. In August 1944, the Jagdpanzer IV was upgunned to carry the 75mm L-70 cannon as mounted on the Panther tank. As the weight of the gun made the chassis nose heavy, the rubber tyres on the first two bogies were replaced with steel wheels. Parallel to the Panzer 470 built by WOMAG was a variation produced by Nibelungenwerke of Austria. A modified Jagdpanzer IV body was grafted directly onto a standard Panzer IV hull. This led to the Panzer IV 70A, distinguishable from the WOMAG model by its vertical sides. The largest, heaviest and most powerful anti-tank gun to see regular service with the German army was the 88mm Pak-43. The weapon realised its maximum muzzle velocity of 1,130 metres per second when using tungsten shot and could penetrate a T-34 up to 3,500 metres. Employing an identical chassis derived from the Panzer III and IV and sharing the same superstructure as the Hummel self-propelled gun, the 88mm Pak-43 armed Nashorn first saw employment during Operation Citadel in July 1943, while similar